we need to keep what's left of our team in place. Again, that doesn't justify it.
He's not, what happens, he's not out of the woods, right? Because there's actually two issues that Andrew Cuomo asked her to look at. The others is the Yankees tickets and the possible perjury charge. What if that comes down in the middle? I mean, how much more can he sustain?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's much stomach for having him resign if that's what you're driving.
No, I mean to close down the budget, which he has been unable to do so far.
Well, in terms of the budget, today we sort of went backwards because there was supposed to be some kind of deal between the Assembly and the State Senate that would resolve the SUNY-CUNY issue, which has been the major stumbling block to finishing the budget. And today, David Patterson, through his spokesman, threw gasoline on the fire, saying that the framework deal between John Sampson, the Senate leader, and Sheldon Silver, the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, was unacceptable.
It's kind of like with Elliot Spitzer, it's deja vu all over again. How many times have we had this conversation on TV and amongst ourselves? Well, do we have a budget or not? Are we close or are we not? Are they negotiating or are they not negotiating? And that's part of Patterson's problem, I think. You never know what he's going to say next.
Right.
And it changes from day to day.
Well, and also, I mean, he said during an interview, a pretty interesting interview that he gave to the Syracuse radio station yesterday, that he had learned something from his first two budgets, which was that he shouldn't have given in so quickly. He actually should have stalled, and and that's what he's going to do now.
It's pretty late. It's getting late to learn that lesson.
My own take on how he's handled this budget thing is that actually he's been, for him, remarkably steady and consistent. I mean,
for him, yeah.
You know, there's still times when he you know, he'll overreact to something, and we talk about, you know, the angry man press conferences, and then, you know, then there's the other kind of press conferences. But he has held a very steady course in this negotiation. He's held a very tough line, and he's gotten stuff that he wanted out of the legislature when it looked like they could be stalemated forever.
Right.
And so I guess it's an interesting question whether these recent revelations about his past behavior and the still pending report about the Yankees tickets, whether they will sort of, you know, once again encourage the legislature to defy him or to ignore him, but they need him at this point. They don't have the votes for an override. They have to wrap up the budget. They need his signature on whatever they do. So he still has a lot of cards that he can play.
Yeah, but he doesn't seem interested in encouraging them to get a deal. I mean, like James said, I think, to say, I don't like that SUNY empowerment plan. It's hard not to, and I've said it a couple of times, and I've been reprimanded for it, but nevertheless, I will say it again, it's hard not to see this as an effort to remain relevant, because as soon as you blow up a deal, you're still relevant. As soon as they get a deal, there's really not all that much that he has a role to do anymore.
Well,
once the budget's done.
Right. And SUNY empowerment needs to get done in order for Bill Stokowski to, we've been through the whole thing.
In fact, people said to me today they were very frustrated by what happened today because they said much of what he wants for SUNY and CUNY is in this agreement, and that the Assembly had moved much more toward David Patterson's position than it had been in weeks.
Well,
and there was a real concern that this is all going to fly apart, and the opportunity. What we're talking about here is using SUNY and CUNY as an economic development tool for a state that's economy isn't doing very well.
We're talking about unhinging the SUNY system from the control of the legislature to allow SUNY. That's what the real problem is, to allow them to raise their own tuitions and keep the money. I think that's what this is about.
The thrust of the governor's statement today was, I can't sign off on this agreement because as far as I know there is no agreement. I haven't seen the details. And I think that was a completely fair thing for him to say, because people that I talked to today who are following this very closely said they weren't sure what the agreement was. They weren't sure how many years the campuses will be authorized to do tuition. They weren't sure what the percentages were. They weren't sure about what the details of this maintenance of effort agreement were, that the state would continue providing a certain amount of aid. So, I mean, the governor is frustrated for good reason, because, you know, the Assembly and Senate will say they've got a deal, but where is it?
Maintenance of effort meaning the state would continue to kick in its fair share
Right.
to the campuses, even if they raise the tuition.
Right. Let's talk for a second. I mean, the reality is that David Patterson will be gone. He's not running for re-election, for election to the position that he has. There is a race to replace him, and some interesting developments today, and I turn to you because it's a Long Island-centric thing. We see Suffolk County Executive Steve Levy, who once hated Rick Lazio, wanted to beat Rick Lazio, all of a sudden decides he would like to embrace Rick Lazio. You say this is a very positive thing for the Senate.
Yes, because we have several Senate races on Long Island that are very much up in the air. Incumbent Brian Foley, a Democrat, is facing a strong challenge from Republican challenger Lee Zeldin. Ken LaValle, who's been in the Senate for more than 30 years, a Republican from the east end of Long Island, is facing the first strong challenge he's had from a Democrat in years. And Steve Levy, even though he's changed his political label, is extraordinarily popular in Suffolk County. And he indicated today that he's very willing to stump for the Senate Republicans. And that's something that's important for them. And earlier this week, Dean Skelos was on this show, and he talked about the fact that they're trying to position themselves as the defenders of upstate and the suburbs.
Right.
That the Senate right now under Democrats only cares about New York City. And Steve Levy helps that argument. Steve Levy also can help Rick Lazio. Yes, they were bitter enemies in the gubernatorial race, but they actually sat next to each other in the Suffolk County legislature. They know each other well.
Well, that's a long time
And
ago.
the question is Steve Levy going to go out and campaign for Lazio? He's going to campaign for the Senate because getting the Senate back in Republican hands, he sees as important to Suffolk County. The question is, will he campaign for Lazio?
I thought it was interesting reading the statement that you quoted. It was, I was thinking I might, this is Steve Levy saying why he might have continued the campaign if it was necessary to get his ideas out there. He said, my ideas have been picked up by other candidates. He didn't say Rick Lazio.
Yes, because the
could have been
property tax
talking-
cap is something that Andrew Cuomo was just hanging out on Long Island with a Republican
Right.
doing.
I
Who
thought that
running
was
for governor
kind of,
doesn't want a property
damning with
tax
faint
cap?
praise kind of a situation.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think the interesting thing about what's going on in the Senate is that the Republicans are being besieged on their own turf. I mean, he just talked about a couple of Republican seats who are now being challenged by serious Democratic challengers. And there was some poll results this week that indicated that it showed the majority of New Yorkers want to get rid of their senator, right? But if you look behind the numbers, it was Republicans that wanted to get rid of their
and
senator.
independents, small I independents, yep.
And so you combine that with all the advantages that go with being in the majority. The fundraising ability, the ability to control, government resources, pork barrel money, what have you, and you combine that with this Republican animus.
The suburban voters, I think, are more unpredictable than voters in New York City, who would just tend to automatically vote for the Democrat, frankly, in many cases. Whereas the suburbanites, they're more of a swing. It's more of a swing district.
And
scenario.
actually, we're going to swing right out of this segment. Thank you very much, Rick. You get the last word. Rick Carlin, Bill Hammond, James T. Medore, thanks very much for joining me.